This is Kol Yisrael, the Voice of Israel, broadcasting from Jerusalem. Sunday, May the 28th, 1967. The time, 8:30 p.m. in Israel, 18:30 hours, Greenwich Mean Time. The Prime Minister, Mr. Levi Eshkol, has stated that the concentration of Egyptian troops in Sinai, coupled with the closure of the Straits of Tiran, constitutes an ever-growing threat to Israel's security. The entire nation, said Mr. Eshkol, must remain in a state of constant preparedness. In Jerusalem, the Magen David Adom First Aid Center requests that the public refrain from the time being from offers of help. The rush of volunteers is such that it hampers the day-to-day running of the center. President Nasser has stated in a Cairo press conference that his country recognizes the right of Palestinians to enter upon what he termed a war of liberation. He added that if this should lead to full-scale hostilities, Egypt would be ready to play her part. Here now is our military commentator, Brigadier General Chaim Herzog.
One of the most delightful anthologies of poetry that I possess is Other Men's Flowers by Field Marshal Lord Wavell, who, at the head of 35,000 British troops, destroyed a much larger Italian force in Cyrenaica in the early days of World War II. Lord Wavell describes in one of his notes how in the darkest hours in the desert he either read poetry or endeavoured to place himself in the shoes of his opposing general. A consideration of the problems facing his opponent inevitably gave him solace and consolation. It is therefore appropriate that we copy a page out of the Field Marshal's book and take a cool look behind the bombastic and scurrilous barrage of hate, threat, and vilification which fills the ether today. The various military estimates published in the world today credit the Egyptian armed forces with a strength of some 4 regular infantry divisions and 2 armoured divisions, in addition to reserves, paratroopers, commandos, etc. Its armoured strength is estimated at between 1,000 and 1,600 tanks. Egypt's air force is estimated to number some 350 first-line planes, which include the MiG-21 fighter and the Ilyushin 28 and Tupolev 16 bombers. The Navy includes 7 destroyers, 11 submarines, MTBs, and missile-carrying craft. The entire Egyptian force is equipped with Soviet materiel and trained, organized, and indoctrinated along Soviet army lines. As publicly announced, of the total regular Egyptian force of some 150,000, over 80,000 are in Sinai, with at least 1 armored division. Estimates published place the tank force in Sinai at some 800. Nasser has declared that it is his intention to attack and wipe out Israel. When evaluating this declaration, let us take Wavell's advice and look at the problems facing the Egyptian commander. With his force of over 80,000 troops and some 800 tanks, he is responsible for a vast area, proportionately speaking. Israel's border with Egypt, including Gaza, is some 270 kilometers long. The coastline in the Gulf of Aqaba to Sharm el-Sheikh, an area of definite interest today to Israel, is 150 kilometers long. The depth of Sinai from the Suez Canal to the border is some 200 kilometers. This signifies a very large area of responsibility in relation to the forces available, giving considerable scope for maneuver in the event that the Israel Defense Forces are called upon to react to an Egyptian attack. If one takes into consideration the strength and preparedness of the Israel Defense Forces, the Egyptian commander has his problems. He knows that in the 2 decisive arms of modern warfare, air and armour, the Israel forces have as good equipment as his forces, if not better. We dare not underestimate the Egyptian forces, nor indeed their equipment, which is good and effective. But as stated, the Egyptian commander has his problems. The area for which he is responsible is very large in relation to the forces available to him. He is commanding an army which has never distinguished itself. It was defeated in 1948. It lost in Sinai in 1956. Its contingent made a very poor showing in the Congo in 1960. And for the past 5 years it has been fighting a war against ill-equipped tribesmen with no spectacular success in the Yemen. It is advisable to see both sides of the coin, and this can be done only in part as for obvious reasons it has not been possible to go into details about one of the main factors, the Israel Defense Forces.
This is Kol Yisrael, the Voice of Israel, broadcasting from Jerusalem. Monday, May the 29th, 1967, 8:30 p.m. The Prime Minister stated today in the Knesset, Israel's parliament, that Israel's considerations must now be not only the assurance of free passage through the Tiran Straits, but also the dangers of Egyptian-inspired aggression on the borders. Work was resumed this afternoon in the fields of Nachal Oz, a border settlement, after Egyptian shelling from the Gaza Strip earlier in the day. Reports state that the Egyptians are withdrawing troops from Yemen. The Syrian president has arrived in Moscow.
In his speech before the trade union movement some days ago, Nasser averred that this time Syria will join with Egypt in the event of the commencement of hostilities. Let us this evening try to evaluate the situation on our northern border and to distinguish between the blood-curdling threats which fill the ether and the cold facts on which decisions are based. What interests us militarily are not words which cost nothing and mean less, but factors on which an estimate of the situation can be made. Syria is a large country, indeed 9 times the size of Israel. Nevertheless, her army is comparatively speaking a small one. It comprises a standing force of about 65,000, which according to estimates published abroad are organized in some 6 infantry brigades and 2 armored brigades, in addition to various units such as a battalion of paratroopers, commandos, etc. Observers estimate that Syria can mobilize 4 to 5 reserve brigades, not all first line. Their air force is estimated at some 100 planes, including some squadrons of MiG-21. Estimates of Syria's tank strength vary from 400 to 500, mainly Russian medium tanks, but also some World War II vintage armor of German origin. Yet there is more to an army than men and materiel. Syria has for the past 18 years been a military dictatorship. Since Hosni Zain took over in a coup d'etat in 1949, Syria has averaged 1 military coup d'etat a year. The current military junta is composed of a grouping of Air Force and Armored Corps officers. Every coup d'etat involves a rapid turnover of officer personnel who are promoted for reasons of loyalty to the new regime without reference to professional ability and experience. The Syrian officer corps has therefore experienced an abnormal turnover, which situation must have some effect on the army's stability and professional standards. Since 1963, the Ba'ath Party has ruled Syria, or more correctly, officers within the Ba'ath grouping. But here too the struggle for power has continued, with Salah Jadid overcoming Amin al-Hafiz in February 1966. This followed much internecine struggle within the party leadership, a struggle which must have left its marks. Nothing affects an army's morale as much as the feeling that political party considerations have a bearing on military decisions. This has been the situation in the Syrian army for years, and its results must inevitably tell when the army has to face a real trial of strength. This weakness may be offset to a degree by the pathological hate of Israel which characterizes the Syrian leadership. When the Syrian commander evaluates the situation, he has a number of factors which he must consider. Of his very long frontier, some 800 kilometers border Turkey, with whom relations are to say the least cool. A further 370 kilometers of border are shared with Jordan, which country broke off relations with Syria after a bombing disaster on the frontier last week. Jordan is only too aware that Syria is the center from which saboteurs and agents are dispatched to operate within its borders. The Syrian-Israel border is some 90 kilometers long. Under normal circumstances, Syria maintains at least half its mobilized force deployed along Israel's front in defense of this frontier and, of course, of Damascus. For it is well to remember that Damascus is the nearest Arab capital city to an Israeli frontier and the most vulnerable, therefore, to attack. The Syrian command reached the conclusion long ago that it is not equipped to take on the Israel Defense Forces alone. Accordingly, it embarked on a policy of sabotage and hit and run rather than of a military confrontation. Under normal conditions, Syria enjoys a tactical advantage over Israel in that her forces are deployed on the high ground overlooking the Jordan Valley and the Sea of Galilee. This is a factor only as long as the situation remains static. The Syrian command must doubtlessly have appreciated that any warlike move on its part turns its topographical advantage into a very temporary one. The Syrian command in deciding on war is well aware that this means war in the heart of the country on the approaches to the capital city. This is opposed to the situation of the Egyptians, who are fighting in a desert far removed from the center of their country. Thus, while we must assume that the Syrians will move in coordination with the Egyptians' forces, as Nasser has announced, nevertheless, when the critical, cruel hour arrives for a cold, calculating decision to move the Syrian army, as opposed to indiscriminate shelling of border villages, we may even witness a certain degree of hesitation on their part. In any event, a purely military evaluation being made by the Syrian commander sitting on the heights and observing Israel's northern military command and its preparations must surely raise some doubts in his mind.
This is Kol Yisrael, the Voice of Israel, broadcasting from Jerusalem. Tuesday, May the 30th, 1967, 8:30 p.m. Radio Cairo announced this morning that the Egyptian fleet had prevented the passage of a tanker through the Tiran Straits. Jewish communities throughout the world continue to demonstrate in support of Israel. And the lead story of the day, Radio Cairo announces the signing of a mutual defense pact between Egypt and Jordan.
King Hussein has apparently given in today to what he estimates to be bitter reality, as witnessed the fact that he sat together with his implacable enemy Nasser and with the man who daily criticizes him in broadcasts from Cairo as the enemy of the people and as a traitor who must be overthrown, namely with Shukeri. It is clear that Hussein was not primarily motivated in this matter by considerations affecting Israel, but rather saw in it an act of personal salvation. Of course, the result is an agreement directed against us, and we dare not regard the new situation which has been created lightly. What is the Jordanian army? The armed forces of Jordan number some 50,000 men. The army is well trained along British lines. It comprises some 9 infantry brigades, an armoured force, parachutists, artillery, etc. Its equipment is primarily British, with its striking force based on the British Centurion tank and the American Patton. These two types of tanks are also used by the Israel Defense Forces. Their air force is comparatively speaking a small one, and would not prove to be a decisive factor in a possible war. Their artillery is also composed of American and British equipment. There is no doubt that Hussein acted as he did out of a feeling of despair following Nasser's recent moves, and because he feels that it is not possible for him to sit on the fence any longer. It is worth recalling at this point that he has assisted in bringing this disaster on himself, as his Radio Ramallah, was one of the main elements in the region which openly encouraged the closing of the Straits of Tiran before Nasser had decided to do so. But we can draw little comfort from this fact. The last time when Jordan signed a similar pact was in 1956, when Nabulsi was Prime Minister and Abu Nawar was Chief of Staff. Both of them were faithful adherents of Nasser. Israel later indicated that this act was one of the reasons influencing it to embark on the Sinai campaign. It is nevertheless worth remembering that despite the signed agreement and the instructions of the Arab Joint Staff to operate against Israel, not a single Jordanian soldier was moved during the Sinai campaign. The Israel Defense Forces have always planned on the worst possible assumption, namely that there will be a possibility of joint Arab action against Israel. On the basis of this assumption and no other, Israel's forces were organized over the years and have been prepared accordingly. Thus, as for every situation, so for this possibility, there certainly exists with the Israel Defense Forces an adequate reply. This agreement is not innocuous, and we dare not treat it lightly. Within our capital city, there is now an army linked by treaty to Nasser. But let us never forget that the distance is equal in both directions, and we trust that this truism will be obvious also to the commanders across the frontier.
This is Kol Yisrael, the Voice of Israel, broadcasting from Jerusalem. Wednesday, May the 31st, 1967, 8:30 p.m. The British Foreign Minister describes the withdrawal of United Nations forces from Egypt as a grave blow to the World Organization. President Johnson convenes the United States Cabinet on the Middle East situation. And on the home scene, General Yitzhak Rabin stated that it was within Israel's power not only to repel any act of aggression, but also to transfer the battle to enemy territory.
Nasser has promised his people to destroy Israel this time. This promise, which has been accompanied by numerous declarations on the radio and television, brings to mind a story from the apocryphal center of Jewish folklore, Helm. It appears that a large river divided Helm into two, and that when the inhabitants wanted to cross from one side of the river to the other, they were tied to a tree trunk and pushed across. On one occasion the tree trunk turned over in midstream, and the unfortunate individual tied to it was suspended with his head in the water and his feet in the air. The wise citizens of Helm stood on the bank and said one to the other, "See what a fool he is. He hasn't crossed the river yet, and already he is drying his stockings." This story is very appropriate to our subject today, for before Nasser can dry his stockings, he has to cross the river, and in his case, the obstacle is the Israel Defense Forces. It is true that every citizen has some form of personal contact with the Israel Defense Forces, but by and large, the concept of the IDF is an abstract one. The Israel Defense Forces is not only an army in the accepted form of the word, but also represents a complete merger of the civilian organization of the country with the war effort on a scale which has few, if any, examples in the world today. There is no aspect of life in the country today, such as the supply of fuel, food, water, electricity, the use of manpower, transportation of all types, civil defense, and all the services of a modern economy, which do not come within the province of defense planning and are not coordinated to the last detail with the Israel Defense Forces establishment. On a signal, in time of emergency, this highly effective and impressive machine moves silently into operation. The Israel Defense Forces are organized into 3 regional commands, North, Center, and South, apart from the air and sea commands. Every regional command is organized in such a manner that it is capable of dealing with all military eventualities and problems which are likely to arise within its area of operation independently and without reference to the other commands. The basic formation in the Israel Defense Forces is the independent brigade. The army organized in brigade groups would, in the event of war, be operating along internal lines of communication and basing itself, logistically speaking, on supply centers and lines of communication which have been well planned in advance. A main principle of the armed forces is flexibility, which enables the General Staff to adapt itself immediately to any new developments on any of the fronts. Regional commands are organized behind the front line of static defense based on the kibbutzim and the villages along the frontier, and behind them, which constitute a self-contained organization and are designed to defend themselves, their general area, and the country, thus leaving the general officer commanding the regional command complete freedom of action to maneuver his forces and to dictate the moves in the war as he sees fit. These settlements have behind them a tradition of which they can be proud, represented by such names as Tel Hai, Tirat Tzvi, Bet Eshel, Yad Mordechai, Negba, the Ganya, etc. Like any general staff worthy of its name, the Israel General Staff has taken into account every possible situation that might arise and has prepared the Israel Defense Forces' answer to each such situation. When the Arabs declare that this time they will all, or some grouping of them, attack together, it should be remembered that the Israel Defense Forces have always assumed the most extreme possibility in this respect and planned accordingly. Our army is based on maximum mobility and flexibility, both on the ground and in the air, and is trained with its highly mobile forces and very efficient parachute units to transfer the battle rapidly in depth into the enemy territory. This is an army commanded on all levels by officers who have been trained in the principle of personal leadership and example, which requires the commander always to be at the head of his men in battle. But as the opposing forces face each other, it is good to remember that in every clash which has occurred to date between Israel and its opponents, whether it be in war, in action along the frontier, in raids across the frontier, in air-to-air battle, or in sea combat, the Israeli forces have invariably had the upper hand. Above all, it must not be forgotten that the Israeli soldier knows what he is fighting for, who he is fighting for, and whom he is defending, and is aware of the fact that for him there remains no alternative but to fight. This awareness in a soldier is worth more than divisions and materiel.
This is Kol Yisrael, the Voice of Israel, broadcasting from Jerusalem. Thursday, June the 1st, 1967, 8:30 p.m. More groups of Jewish volunteers are expected to arrive from overseas both this evening and tomorrow. British Prime Minister Harold Wilson leaves London for Canada and the United States for talks on ensuring the free passage of shipping through the Tiran Straits. The United Press reports that during the last month, the Egyptians were responsible for the deaths of 360 people in Yemen by means of poison gas attacks from the air.
Tonight I want to discuss our air problem. This is a problem which very rightly interests everyone because it represents the medium which under certain conditions is capable of bringing the front line to the populated areas. The civil defense preparations which are of great importance create an awareness of the problem, but I get the impression that the fertile imagination of human beings tends to put it out of all proportion to reality. The best way to evaluate it, therefore, is to examine our problem on the basis of facts. The average citizen sees in his mind's eye the blitz of World War II, when hundreds of German bombers bombed British cities, and when thousands of British and American bombers attacked German cities. Those of us who personally experienced these events during the fighting in Europe can testify that even after the heaviest bombing attacks, many people lived to tell the tale. However, I want to take this opportunity to emphasize that within the context of the existing Arab air forces as they are today in the Middle East, it is ridiculous to talk of a possible blitz because it is simply not practicable. The main Arab air force today is that of Egypt. There is little point in discussing other Arab air forces. They can add here and there, but the main problem is that of Egypt, and once it is solved, the others will not be of any great importance. Since the arrival of the jet plane in the Middle East, the Israel Air Force has met the Arab air forces twice, once during the Sinai campaign, and a second time in the course of the past year since July 1966. Let us take the past year, which is probably more important, as it refers to types of equipment which exist today in the area. The score at the moment stands at 11-0 in favor of Israel. Since July 1966, when Arab planes began to fly over the border areas, 11 of them have been shot down, 8 Syrian, 2 Egyptian and 1 Jordanian, without a single Israeli plane being damaged. It seems to me that these results speak for themselves. In order to estimate correctly the possibilities of the Egyptian Air Force, let us divide it for the sake of convenience into 3 groupings. First of all, the very excellent Russian supersonic fighter MiG-21, which is not a bombing plane, and whose tasks include the defense of Egypt against the Israeli Air Force. There is such a problem too, the defense of their airfields, and cover for their forces in the field. In short, all the normal functions of a fighter command. This group, it is estimated, numbers 100 to 150 planes. The second grouping is composed of all other types of fighter planes, approximately 100 of them, which are subsonic in speed and limited in range. Presumably, their main function would be as air cover over the field of battle. The third grouping comprises the bombers, which are estimated at approximately 70 Russian-type Ilyushins and Tupolevs. The majority are Ilyushins, a slow and obsolescent plane by modern standards, and the remainder the Tupolev 16. What constitutes Israel's defense against this force? In the first line, we have a highly modern radar screen designed to reveal any unfriendly plane before it reaches our frontier, and to scramble our Air Force with its supersonic fighter Mirage in the lead. In addition, we have the American Hawk ground-to-air missile, which is considered to be one of the best of its type in the world against low-flying aircraft. In this connection, it is worth mentioning that while the Tupolev is not built to carry out its bombing operation over a height of 30,000 feet, the Hawk's range in height is in the region of some 50,000 feet. Furthermore, the Tupolev, with a maximum speed of 550 kilometers an hour, will have to endeavor to avoid the Mirage flying at least 1,500 kilometers an hour. In addition, modern anti-aircraft radar-operated artillery is deployed against air attacks. It is but a matter of days since we saw the L-70 in the Independence Day parade. All these elements, radar, our planes, the missiles, and the anti-aircraft artillery, are coordinated by a highly sophisticated electronic system, making a reply possible in a matter of seconds. And above all, in the Israeli cockpit sits a pilot who at the same time embodies an ability to react swiftly, advanced modern technical know-how, a complete mastery of a highly involved and sophisticated weapon, the traditions and self-sacrifice of countless Jewish generations, the spirit of pioneering and volunteering with which it now transpires this people is deeply imbued, and the brazen cheek of the Sabra, at times irritating, but definitely in face of the enemy. This wondrous admixture is the Israeli pilot, the best pilot in the forces ranged one against the other today. It is cold comfort to anybody in the region of a bomb that falls to know that not many bombs have fallen. All preparations, therefore, are not only justified but essential. Nevertheless, the damage that can be created by one of the planes in the Arab armies today is not as great as that wrought by the Syrian shelling of Gadot some weeks ago, and we saw how, thanks to adequate preparations, shelters, etc., there was no loss of life. Obviously, every precaution must be taken, but I must say in all sincerity that if I had to choose today between flying in an Egyptian bomber bound for Tel Aviv or being in Tel Aviv, I would, out of a purely selfish desire for self-preservation, opt to be in Tel Aviv.